Well, can I start by saying to perhaps to Stephen Freudman how honoured I am that last night you chose me to replace the speaker at short notice, even if you did ask the Rod Stewart lookalike first. Having not had much time to prepare this talk and not really having much in the way of notes, to be honest, from the previous speaker, there's not much in the way of a sort of visual presentation, and I apologize for this. Obviously, left to my own devices, I would offer you a fascinating 45-minute film of Chinese people in shops. Look closely at the 43rd man from the left. See what he's doing. In fairness to Paco Underhill, who did seem to have a bit of a thing about bum brushing. I recall that section lasting about a day and a half. I think the bum brushing stuff is perfectly understandable. I mean, think about it. If you ran a business yourself, which exclusively involves talking out of your arse, of course you'd want to have the maximum possible with it. Now, unlike Kath, I'm operating under a slight handicap in this presentation, in that I've never actually been to China. Well, not China proper. I've been to the White Swan in Woodford Green on a number of occasions, but I've never actually been to China proper. Indeed, I worked out this morning that Muscat is the closest I've ever been to China. And with the assistance of a very nice atlas from the business center, the scale on the atlas, and in the absence of a ruler, one of those nice toothbrushes you get from the bathrooms here, I have calculated that Muscat is 1,462 miles away from the western edge of China. Never mind. I don't think it's necessary to have been to China to talk about China and the future. It's not necessary to have been to China to think about China. After all, I have never been a woman. That does not mean I have not thought about lesbian sex. So, modern China, a very brief history. 1949 to the present day. A bit like a Chinese meal, this comes in essentially 4 helpings. First stage, 1949 to 1979. Not a lot of business for you lot there. China was essentially a dictatorship in the hands of a megalomaniac who made it his mission in life to kill off anyone else with half a brain. Much like the ITT under Stephen Freudman. Mercifully, that period ended. A Deng Xiaoping character emerged. I know many of you are praying for the ITT's Deng Xiaoping character to emerge, but it's no sign of it very quickly. Between 1979 and 1989, you had a sort of cautious opening to the outside world. Elementary capitalism was introduced, and the one-child policy, which I'll refer to later. But even by the late 1980s, there were no more than 3 million outside visitors in any year. Then the third phase, the catastrophe of the Tiananmen Square massacre, where for 6 years afterwards, the Chinese authorities seemed to have no idea what direction they wanted to go in politically or strategically, and travel, like everything else, more or less flatlined. And then finally, since 1995, when that period of uncertainty ended, the real great leap forward, China's full embrace of capitalism, the emergence of China as a serious global player, and 21 million tourists visiting in 2005. And that transformation, I think, is captured by 2 statistics I would like to give to you, both of which relate to the Olympic Games. The first is that 47% of all the concrete used in the world this year will be used in China. That is an extraordinary statistic. 47% of all the concrete. And the second is that the Chinese intend to spend on infrastructure, amenities, and apartments in advance of the Beijing Games, $160 billion US. That's a lot of money. It's almost as much as Trevor Harding spent in the bar last night. But nonetheless, what's the bigger picture? It seems to me that if I were in your shoes, or indeed my shoes, there are three really big questions we need to ask about modern China. The first, you look terrible doing like that, didn't you? The first, and Kath alluded this, is from your point of view. Is China a market for European-based consumers in your minds, or is it a fresh market of Chinese consumers to go elsewhere? 21 million visitors, as I said last year, from outside. The total number of journeys made by Chinese people outside mainland China last year was only 24 million, of which more than half were business trips, and a third were to Macau and Hong Kong, places you could argue are really wider China. So the number of genuine visits of Chinese people measured against its population was about 1.5% at top whack, including business flights. Now compare that to the United Kingdom, where the number of journeys outside the UK was in fact 140% of the total population size. And you'll realize the sheer infancy of China and the outside world. We talk about China opening up, but it's all very, very relative. The second big question is for China itself. What are the side effects of the extraordinary transformation that we're witnessing? China has gone from a society which was 75-25 rural-urban to one which is now 65-35 urban-rural in the space of less than 15 years. It took Britain after the Industrial Revolution 125 years to do the same thing. That's the sort of warp speed we're talking about. Think of it in terms of social class. The middle class in China is roughly defined as somebody with household income of 18,000 to 36,000 US dollars. Okay. Weighted, obviously, for time at moment's inflation. In 1986, the middle class in China consisted of 0.2% of the population. In 1996, 2.0% of the population. In 2006, 20% of the population. And by 2020, 40% of the population. That is wild. That is a revolution in class terms, wider than anything Marx ever envisaged, and rather in the opposite directions that the chap in the highway imagines. And then there is the question internally for China of age. Right now, only 10% of the Chinese population is age 60 or above. It's a young country, and that's massively fueling its economic boom. There's an awfully large young workforce there. But the trends start reversing quite quickly because of the impact of the one-child policy. By 2015, China's working-age population will have peaked. By 2020, its total population will have peaked. By the year 2040, 30% of the Chinese population will be aged over 60, compared with 10% now. Now, obviously, there are winners from that sort of thing. There are winners from a society in which there are many more very old people. The Daily Telegraph, I regret to admit. But you can't have the sort of sheer force of 10% growth driven by a cheap labor market, largely being sucked out of the countryside, when all those social phenomena start to unravel. So there's a really fascinating question about China as to how long the so-called Chinese miracle can last. And then finally, there is a question for China and the wider world. It's very glibly said that it's inevitable that China will become a superpower and perhaps even displace the United States. I think that's rather too sweeping. It assumes that superpowers are measured only by the size of their economies or the number of members of their armed forces. In fact, what the Cold War showed us was that soft power is the key to being a superpower. The real advantage the United States had over the Soviet Union was cultural. People watched American movies. They listened to American music. They wore American jeans. They aspired to those sorts of things, closely bonded into the American lifestyle. I don't think there's any evidence yet of China emerging as an alternative model, and if it doesn't become a cultural and a political superpower, and I think it's inconceivable it can become a political superpower without the one-party state largely disappearing, that it's not going to be a superpower in the sense that we understand it. So finally, with those big picture thoughts in mind, I'd like to leave you with words that they frequently say in China itself. Nisha, yabon dati, wakai. Godao. Noa fushi, Reta, Misu, Banfor, Wanduzima, Hoi, Kika, Yipo. I have no idea what it means, but they say it a lot in China. Thank you very much.